Hello and good evening. This is our March broadcast with School of Celebrancy, and a warm welcome to any of you who may be joining us just now, and an equally warm welcome to those of you who may be joining us for this chat at another time. It's nice to see that a few have joined us already. Do please, as usual, drop us a comment to let me know who you are and where you are. Oh, lovely to see you again, Linda Jane. Linda Jane from Ayrshire. And shortly we're going to be joined by, hello Simone, just down the road in Lewes. We're shortly going to be joined by Rudolf, who is joining us from Vienna. And those of you who saw the publicity for this broadcast will know that Rudolf has done a huge number of funerals over the last few years, since making quite an unusual career move from working in opera direction to becoming a very, very busy funeral celebrant. So without further ado, I'm going to add Rudolf to the stream now. Hi, Rudolf.
Hi, River. Good to be with you, and hi, everyone out there. Great to be with you. Thank you.
It's always interesting, I think, just to start by saying, what's the weather like in your part of the world this evening, Rudolf?
Well, it's rather nice and sunny, but of course the sun is not at its full strength yet. So the nights, because it's clear, are rather cold. So -6, -7 centigrade over here at night. But days are nice, and my cat loves the sun already. She's 17, so she takes every sun ray with great pleasure.
Yeah. Well, we're all a bit rainy and blustery here on the south coast at the moment. But yes, we have mostly a British gathering this evening.
Yes.
So I am going to begin by asking you, Rudolf, how did you become a funeral celebrant? How did that happen? How did you make this rather unusual career segue?
Yes. Well, actually, it is without pride, but it is rather unusual. And I may say, even though some of my colleagues of my previous work don't quite believe me, but too bad for them. It was a step that I took really deliberately. I had been working, I'm 61 now, and I had been working 40 years basically in the performing arts world. I started at 17 or almost 16. And at some point I just thought, well, I was happy enough to have a nice career in that, and especially in opera. And but I thought there must be something else to life, and I still like theater. I still like watching. I write a lot. I'm creative writer, but there was something else in life I was looking for. I wasn't happy anymore with the day-to-day business, so to speak. And like sometimes coincidences happen in life, it was a real coincidence, because I knew I had to look for something. But when you are 56, you just can't out of the blue say, well, now I do something completely differently, right? You have a life, you have children, etc. And suddenly on November the 1st, 2017, I remember very clearly that moment. I opened the newspaper here in Vienna, which I must say I rarely do. I'm not a typical paper reader. And I found an interview. Now, no, it's not. It was actually an article about funeral celebrants here in Austria. Of course, November 1st is the day to do that. And I thought, something in me said, well, I think that is it. It sounds weird, but probably not to our audience here. But And of course, my background is also very much in spiritual life. It's not just opera. And
Mhm.
I thought, how does that work? And I contacted a friend who I knew from the opera side. I was organizing the music during funerals. He has a group who does singing and organ play and stuff. He organizes that. I said, do you know how that is working here? I said, no, I don't, but I can get the information. So he put me in touch with a lady who is running a little agency here, working with funeral celebrants. It's not that it's such a huge business, of course, and I met her, and well, what should I say? 3 weeks after having opened the newspaper, I did my first funeral.
Wow.
Yes, well, I had done a couple for friends before, but I mean, this was really professionally the first, and um, people find it sometimes strange when I say I liked it, but I certainly did.
Mhm. Yeah.
And then said yes, that's something for me. And I had the chance. It was winter time, so with the occupation I had at the time, I was running the artistic program for a medieval castle here in Austria. So in winter there was not much going on because of weather. It was more a summer business. I could spend 3 days a week with funerals, which gave me the opportunity to find out if that was something I would like to do on a full scale. And after a couple of months, I said yes. And I said to castle people, well, that's it. Thank you. Look for another manager there. And from
Wow.
as by June 2018, I was a full time funeral celebrant here in Vienna. So that's how it all started. It seems strange to many, but honestly, it's probably one of the best moves I did in my life.
Wow. So you mentioned when we spoke before this broadcast that there are some very particular sort of traditions around death and funerals in Vienna. And I came across that there's a museum of funerals in Vienna, which I've never heard of.
Indeed.
Yeah. So can you tell us
Yes.
a little bit about?
Well, it seems to me, of course, when you live in a tradition, it's always hard to really have a neutral look on it. But it seems that the tradition here in Vienna. I'm not Viennese myself. I'm from the west of Austria, so and born in Switzerland. So I have a bit of an outside view. But of course, my professional view is entirely based on the experience here. But it seems that the Viennese from a long time ago have had a very particular touch towards death and death rights, and um, it's, for example, very important for many families here. Of course, it changes with the younger generations, but to have a grave that when you will die, even if it's 40 years away, supposedly, that where your gravestone will be, and even people pick their graves, and we have that expression, a dialectal expression, a schöne Leich, which is a beautiful dead body. So that's what people want to have when they die. They want to have
Oh,
a nice funeral. It's important to them, and so there is a certain ritual around that, which includes, of course, the usual flowers and decorations, but also that you need to have somebody there who leads the ceremony. Mostly, of course, in the olden times, that was a priest, Catholic
mhm,
priest in most of the cases here in Austria. But more and more, that has, of course, also changed, or is still changing, especially in the cities, towards people like me who do that. And those traditions are very old. So you have those old traditions with horses, who black horses who would pull the cart, right? And
mhm. Yeah.
and very special carts that were built for the occasion, and who has the nicer cart. And those traditions are sometimes still around. Of course, they are too expensive for most people nowadays. And from those traditions grew out that museum. And it's actually the Vienna City Funeral Company, which was uh, uh, a city company at the time, which now over the last 10, 15 years has been privatized, but still run by the city. But they have, of course, now many other funeral institutions who you can book. But the big one, and the city cemeteries. We have 52 cemeteries in Vienna, which for a city of 2 million roughly is quite a big number.
A large number, yeah.
And so the city takes care of all those graveyards, and that organization has created that museum, probably quite famous even abroad, the Wiener Zentralfriedhof, the Central Cemetery, which is a huge area, which is the second largest cemetery in Europe. And at one of those main buildings, they created that museum, which is fairly interesting, from coffin building through those traditions from the old times into traditions today, and even showing Lego games, Lego toys, where you can build your own coffin. And it's sometimes a bit weird, but of course they take also into account the modern times and have T-shirts and stuff like that. Yeah.
One thing that really struck me about what you said there, when you talked about the expression about people having a beautiful dead body, or
Yes.
beautiful death, it was, we often talk about, certainly talk about it on the funeral training course, and it's something that there's a whole conversation going on, I think quite a kind of global conversation across the United States and Europe about the kind of death phobia that's quite prevalent in the Western world, and the sort of death denial. That's a big problem in a lot of places. And when you said that, I wondered, well, perhaps it's not as prevalent there. Perhaps there's some kind of surviving tradition, or do you think it's being...
I'm not so sure. Sometimes I have a feeling, well, Vienna has always been a center of mixing of cultures. We are the crossroads here, and that might have played a role here. I think we have a lot of Slavic influences here. We have even Turkish influences, because Vienna was besieged twice with a lot of dead bodies created by Turkish Osman in the Osman times back in the 17th and 15th centuries. Then that has created a lot of traditions here, not only around death, those mixes that happened in this country. But I must say, I think the 21st century has hit as well. I think the fear of death, and I'd rather call it not having a relation to what death means, is just as much of a problem here as it is elsewhere. We might just be a bit more extrovert about it and hide it better, but I think it's very strong.
Rudolf, you also mentioned your spiritual life and your spiritual path as being a big thread that sort of led you towards this work. So could you tell us a little bit about that and how that applies to your work?
I think, if I may, just before I get to that, I think, of course, there is a part of the theater man who knows and has been taught how to speak. Just technically, I'm not talking about content here, but when you do 3 funerals a day, which happens to me regularly, you have to speak 3 times half an hour, and mostly without microphone. And so you have to be able to do that. And that's a training. And of course, the theater has helped me with that. But much more important is, as what you just mentioned, that spiritual background, because one maybe obvious part is that I have been a Freemason for almost 30 years now. And of course, for those who know Masonry, know, without telling any secret, that the relation to death, as in many spiritual and also occult societies. I don't see Freemasonry as an occult society, but it's part of the same right to go through death and resurrection in a symbolic way. So you become acquainted with what death could maybe mean. We all don't know, but we have some relationship to that. And honestly, even before I started doing that, I saw when I had to attend funerals for professional or private reasons that gave me some comfort and gave me some ideas why those things happened like they do. And
Mm.
I try to, and then, well, my personal spiritual path has started maybe 40 years ago with shamanism in the beginning. I had at some point a strong link, without ever being a member, but strong link to anthroposophy. So those Rudolf Steiner, who was of course Austrian influences, were quite strong with me. And with time, well, some of you might know I'm running a podcast which is talking about the Western esoteric traditions, but that's not something that I only talk about. But I, I, as a solitary, practice a lot of those things in ceremonial magic, etc. Now, that is maybe not an obvious link to that. I'm not doing any rituals when well, kind of, but I'm not doing an obvious ritual when
Mhm.
I do a funeral. But it has built some spiritual strength in me, which I believe
Mm.
helps me to bring over the message, because for me, a funeral is officing for the person who has left us, but also for the people who are here and stay. And so it's
Yes.
kind of trying to
Yes.
find that balance. And the spiritual work I do, I think, has helped me in finding that balance, and
Mm.
even maybe building bridges from time to time when it's needed.
Okay. Mm. Yes, when you say that our funeral training course in the School of Celebrancy is called Serving the Living and the Dead, for
Yes, well,
exactly
there you are. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
those reasons. Um, so can you tell us a little bit about the sort of practicalities of how your working life works and how you became established so quickly
Mhm.
as well? One thing you mentioned that I'd never heard of before was a funeral celebrant agency. I think you said something like that. Was it?
Yes, well, as I said, this is still a very young, well, let's hate calling it a business, but it is in the end, of course.
Mm.
I live off that, so I have to call it like that. Actually, it's still quite young over here. I think 25 years ago, it hardly ever happened that somebody like me would appear on a funeral. It was
Mhm.
priests or nothing, basically, or the family who would maybe speak if they really didn't want a priest, which of course happened also back then. But about 25, 30 years ago, a man who was working actually at the Austrian Radio Corporation, he did that from time to time for friends, and it started to be the then still only Vienna funeral company started to feel that there was a need for that, and they found out about him, and so they asked him if he would like to do that professionally and also organize maybe a few other people who would do that. And well, he said yes, and he started it, and it's today his daughter who is running that little agency,
Okay.
which is, we are something like 12 to 15 people, we are not many, who serve Vienna and what is called Lower Austria. So that's the maybe 100 miles around Vienna area that we serve. And I think it's only two of us who really do it full time, like I do.
Mhm.
And others are actors who do it from time to time, or people who just do it 3 times a week, or something like that. And actually, the funeral companies go to the agency and say when they get a client who wants a funeral celebrant, they will call the agency and say, well, we need someone, and then this lady will every day check the schedule, and kind of looks
Okay.
how
Ah,
best distribute those needs among the celebrants, so that also we don't have to travel from here to there and back,
yeah,
so that we have a bit of an organized life anyway.
yeah. Because I guess it's the same there as it is everywhere, that the demand for celebrant-led funerals is just steadily increasing, isn't
Oh,
it?
definitely,
As
definitely.
the as we move through the generations, and I think this generation currently, who are, perhaps our senior generation, are perhaps the last to be a majority religious generation.
Definitely.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. And it's interesting how this religious tradition, even with people who are not religious themselves at all, I
Mhm,
always ask in the end, when I do my preparation, if they want an Our Father being prayed at the end of the
mhm.
ceremony, because I know even people who are not religious, just by tradition,
Mhm.
they absolutely want that, even if I'm the only one to say it, because they don't even
Yes.
know the text anymore. But it's somehow one of those traditions with the elderly people, especially as you say, that stays. On the
Mhm.
other side, we see more and more individuality in the needs and
Mhm.
in the requests, which often is not easy to reconcile with the funeral companies, because they, not all of them at least, or many of them, have not yet grasped that movement, and are not
Mhm.
really very open to individual ideas and services. And it's sometimes up to us celebrants also to find a diplomatic way between servicing the client in the way they think they want it, and um, dealing with the company, the funeral company, with the undertaker, to
Yeah.
to to offer that in a way that is possible. Of course, not everything is also feasible or even
Mhm.
should be done or can be done, because we have, it's a big city, and in the central cemetery I explained before, there might be a funeral every half hour or every hour at least.
Mhm.
So you have also to deal with logistics at some point, and have to
Yes.
find the right way between logistics and not letting logistics being felt by the families, by the people
Mhm.
who you serve.
Yeah. And can you tell us a little bit about how the process works? You mentioned your preparation.
Mm,
What's your working process like? So say, take us through from, you get the call from the agency saying, can you do a service at
mhm.
such and such a place and time? Then what happens?
Well, the first thing I do is, of course, calling the client and
Mm.
introducing myself. And I never do my long talk with them at the first call. I always, because of course, in a way, they are, you call them at some point, they don't even expect it. They know they get a call at some point, but they
Mhm.
might be doing their shopping or being with the children or whatever. And I say, when can we speak? Right? Probably
Mhm.
mostly for the next day, because we have only 4 days or so left, right? And so I tried to fix a phone uh, um, interview, so to speak, where we have both time for the following day. And what I always do except when I feel it's really elderly widows or so who don't have email, or who are not in the right shape to do that at that moment, but I normally ask for that they send me a little email with just a summary of the life of the person who
Mhm.
died, because it's not only for me so that I have something in front of me when I then speak. It's also because I've realized that people um, then sit down and think about it for the first time after it has happened.
Mm.
Normally, when they go to the funeral company, the undertaker, they are still under shock. It's mostly the first or second day after the death of the loved person, and they are asked tons of questions with a lot of formalities, and most of them do that in a dream. It's like you
Mhm.
function, but you don't think at that moment. And so when I call a few days later and ask them to sit down and write a few things down, it's often, not always, but often, that I realize it's the first time they do that since it has happened. And so it's not only information for me, but also a kind of, I wouldn't call it therapy. That's too big a word, but it's a first step to find yourself again. And so the next day I will speak to them. Depends. Sometimes it takes 20 minutes, sometimes it takes an hour. It's different from case to case, but I take the time that's needed, and after that I let it rest again for a day with me. And it's then the day before the funeral that I will sit down and make my notes and write my speech and see
Hmm.
how I will design the ceremony with the music they chose, with ideas or wishes they had, and especially with the information that they gave me. And yeah, well, and then I go and try to do my best to do it in a way that helps everyone.
Hmm. So you mentioned that you usually only have 4 or 5 days, did you say, between getting
Maximum,
the
yeah,
thoughts?
yeah,
Oh
yeah,
wow, wow,
yeah,
that
yeah.
is very different from here because typically a week would be a short turnaround for most UK funeral celebrants. We
Right,
often get
right.
up to a couple of weeks. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, no, it's very different here, but
Mhm.
it's also depend. I mean, now with time, I've been doing this for 4.5 years now. More and more, I get inquiries a bit ahead of time because people want this, especially me, right? So they have heard about me or have been to a funeral where I was servicing there, and so they say, could we have him? And in those cases, sometimes I get it a bit earlier, but it doesn't really change the rhythm. It has also, I mean, it is because we get those informations usually there with from the 3 or 4 or 5 days ahead of time. But uh, honestly, when you do as many as I do, I wouldn't want to write a speech for Thursday on Monday when I have two other funerals on Tuesday and Wednesday, if you see what I mean.
Yes,
Um,
absolutely. Yeah.
it's not sitting down and writing, which is the main task. It's getting yourself into the right spirit for that person and for that family. And that's different every time. And when I do that 3 days ahead, I wouldn't be able to do it. I sometimes do it in the morning before I go off for another funeral, which is okay, but I prefer doing it when I come home from those days funerals and prepare for
Mhm.
next day, so that I'm not in interference with intermediate tasks.
Mhm.
I think it's important. Yeah,
So how many funerals are you doing in a typical week then, Rudolf?
typical weeks would be between 8 and 10.
Wow. Wow.
Mm.
So several most days.
Yes, most
Yeah.
days two, basically. Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Goodness. So I have always wondered, how can people possibly do that kind of volume
Yeah.
of work? And yeah, what do you find it psychologically or spiritually, tiring? How do you equip yourself and prepare yourself and look after
Yeah.
yourself at work?
Well, I think honestly, I think that my spiritual background is the main reason why I don't say this is true for everyone who does that, right? But I need that stability in life, and of course that's also due to my wife, who I have a very stable partnership with her, and I when I get home, I feel happy to get home. I mean, that's all part of it. Of course, it's.
Yeah.
I think you know what I mean. And then when I am at the funeral, I always try to link somehow also with the dead person. I don't mean that in any spiritist way, but I try to establish a connection with that person,
Yeah.
and with the people who are here, but more with that person here, because that's more a fixing point. It's easier somehow.
Hmm.
Um, and another thing, I am often, that's also a tradition, that people go off for a drink or for lunch after a funeral. Here, I don't know if that's the case also in the UK. In the
Yes.
UK,
Yeah.
they do that often here, and I'm often invited for that. I will never go there, never ever,
Mhm.
because I have to find the right balance between being close to what's happening to the family and to that person, but not as close as to get emotionally too involved. Because when you go there and have a coffee and speak to people afterwards and they tell you all the stories, if you do that 3 times a week, I think it can really become emotionally a bit tough, right? So it's a question. I've been trained now. That might sound weird when you don't know what it is to have acting trainment, because if you have a good acting trainment, it means that you are involved but not concerned, right? And in a way, I think what I learned on that end helps me also a lot. It's not just talk, not just speaking. It's knowing how to be in the role of the person who cares about the people, but not going as close as to become one of them yourself.
Yeah.
And I get the impression that's even what they expect from you to some extent. They want that stable person. Otherwise, they could speak themselves. They know the person better than I do. They are
Yes.
able to tell the stories better than I do. But they need stability. They need somebody to cling to in that difficult moment.
Yeah.
And I'm not there to weep with them. I'm there to care for them and to give stability.
Yeah.
At least that's in most of the cases the impression
Yeah.
that I get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It can be very, very reassuring to people, can't it, when they are thrown into a completely abnormal and strange world when they're dealing with death, and just the fact that
Absolutely.
we can go and it's our day-to-day normal, and we're
Absolutely.
comfortable with it and we're at ease with it, and that in
Absolutely.
itself is of great value to people, isn't it?
Absolutely. Emotionally, but even
Mm,
technically, when you call them the first time, you often see they're relieved. They've heard the voice. They're
mhm.
reassured. Oh, I don't know. Do you know when will the music be played? I say, well, let me
Yeah,
deal with that. Don't worry. Oh, thank you. It's
yeah,
just the relief, then not to have to care about certain things.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, I think that's probably the sort of top of the list of what people want when they're looking for somebody to hold a funeral for them is, I think the key is the word hold, isn't it? I'm waving my hands now because they want to
Absolutely.
kind of feel like a safe pair of hands are
Yes, that's a
holding
nice
them.
English expression, to hold a funeral. Exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
definitely. Definitely.
Um, so are most of the funerals that you conduct, are they cremations or burials or a mixture of both? Or
It's a mixture of both. It's more and more cremations, of course. Also, that's a trend of our time. And of course, as in the Catholic world, non-religious people have a tendency to have more cremations. I have probably more cremations than the average would actually be, but it's about half, almost
Mhm.
half by now, half cremation, half burials. It's really a trend, and we have more and more also burials under a tree. So there are now 4 or 5 wood woods around Vienna where burials are allowed and which are dedicated to burials actually.
Yeah.
But it's of course always urns, and urns that are specially designed to within, I think it's 2 years, they have to dissolve and
Mhm.
disappear. And that's certainly something that's happening more and more. Not
Mhm.
always, as you probably know, not always easy when you are in the middle of the wind and the storm, and conduct a funeral in that. But it has also its charms.
Mhm.
I had a talking about wind, if I may tell that story, because I found it so. It was just an impressive moment. I had to do a funeral for a 2 months old lately on a Saturday morning, and the family was a mixed family. The mother was from a Turkish background, the father from a German background, and they had moved to that tiny place outside Vienna, place with maybe 600 souls who lived there. So a tiny cemetery, a really nice, oldish but tiny cemetery, and they had put that small coffin there in the middle of the graveyard, in the open air, of course. And it was a very, very sunny day, but cold and very windy, very, very windy. And I don't normally keep a moment of silence. I personally don't think that's, in most of the cases, it's not a good thing to do, but it's my personal view. But there I said, well, I would do it because we have, they were not religious, but part of the family was religious. The back family was religious. And so what do? You can't say a prayer for one or the other. So I just said, okay, we keep a moment of silence and everybody can pray the way they feel it, or not at all, or just be with the baby, whatever they feel they would like to do in that moment. And at the very moment I say that, and let's keep a moment of silence, the wind stopped.
Mm.
But really from a stormy wind to nothing. And that was, I mean, it was probably a coincidence, but even now when I say it, it still gives me a slight shudder because it was
Mm.
such an extraordinary moment. And those moments, you live them sometimes. That was a very special moment, but you often have special moments which give you back so much of the work you put in it, and you can't measure that.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah.
very special profession that I do, and I feel extremely privileged to now be able to, well, to live off that. Also, it sounds
Yes.
weird, but to
Yeah.
be able to do that is a privilege, really.
It is an enormous privilege. I absolutely agree. And one of the things that I say to my students, about
Mm.
how this works in terms of making a living from being a
Yeah,
celebrant.
yeah.
The way I see it is that there are two parallel transactions that go on. And on the one hand, we perform a professional service for which we receive a professional fee.
Mm.
And on the other hand, we're being given an incredible privilege to accompany people in these most important moments in their lives, whether that be for
Absolutely.
weddings or baby names or funeral.
Hmm.
And for that, we repay with everything that we can bring and give for that moment, is my
Absolutely.
feeling. Yeah.
And it's very important to see both sides,
Mm,
equally important also, and keep that balance right
mm,
as well. Yeah.
mm. So, yeah, I was asking you about you do a mixture of burials and
Okay.
cremations,
Yeah.
and what I always talk to the families about is I say, well, when it comes to the committal, and I usually explain, that if it's a cremation, this doesn't mean that your mum or dad is going anywhere. They don't go anywhere until after we've all left the chapel, but it's the moment of collective farewell. That is how I see the committal.
Hmm.
Um, do you have a particular way that you always conduct that part of the service, or does that depend on which family you're working with?
Well, to be honest, I do have quite a particular way of doing that. Of course, sometimes when you feel you are completely off track with the people you are with, then you might adapt it a bit. But then I think I can only do it in a way that really lets them feel the emotion if I'm committed to it. So committal is also my commitment, right? So
Yes.
so it I couldn't do it otherwise. So um, for me, it's very much like closing circles, and it's actually it's three types of circles that I often talk about. Well, the circle of life, of course, which you can explain in different ways. It's not only from death to birth, but also when you bring someone back into a grave where their wives or parents are already
Mm,
in that grave. It's also a way of closing that circle of life. And but we also have to do another circle is that circle where the person has stood in the middle of the circle during their lives. And when that people that person dies, then we have the impression that that circle is broken and there is an open end to the circle. And it is the duty, I would say. It's more than it's more just than we should do it. It's a duty to close that circle again and to carry on. within that circle without that person, and not replace, but taking their place, and
Mhm.
doing their work, carrying on with their work, right? And
Mhm.
I think that's the second type of circle. And then of course the third type of circle I talk about is the circle of nature,
Mhm.
which is giving the body back to the elements, and especially in the case of a cremation, of course, that's easier to explain, but it's also with a burial, it's easy to explain somehow, but you have to involve all four elements into that, and the hope that stays is, and that's the thing I very often use, is often people use roses on graves or on coffins or on urns, etc. And the rose is, with its five petals, is the symbol for the fifth element, for the spirit and the love that extends from that spirit, and that is to me like a bridge over into that other place. We all don't know what it looks like, but that fifth element, the spirit and the bridge, is something that stays as a bridge, and that's that's a way how I mostly do my committals. Yes,
Yeah.
and I
So,
think most people understand quite well what is meant by it.
okay. So, you talk about those things. Do you have like a set form of words? Do you speak to the deceased when you come to that moment?
Yes, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Before that, I mostly speak to the attendants. Sometimes it happens that during the speech, also I also turn over, especially
Mhm.
when the when the family told me, hey, you know, my mother, she didn't want that we cry, and she wanted to have a funeral with
Mhm.
not black
Mhm.
clothes, and we should laugh and we should have a good day, and blah blah blah. And when I hear that, I say, okay, you wait and see what's happening, right? Because
Mhm.
it's, of course, it never turns out like that, because when they get to the point, in 98% of the cases, they suddenly see it quite differently. And
Mhm.
in those cases, I often start by turning to the coffin, saying, look, I know that you wished it like that, but you have to understand it's not that easy, you know. and
Yeah.
and so, like, excusing that people now cry anyway, but of course it's an excuse for them that they are allowed
Mhm.
to cry.
Yeah.
And but otherwise I mostly speak to the attendants, but at the very end, then I turn to the coffin, and I do my committal
Mhm.
and farewell, so to speak,
Yes.
to them. Yes.
Yeah. And you talked about crying. Is there a lot of crying at your services?
Of course, that depends, right? Of course, that
Yeah.
depends on the
Yeah.
situation. Yes, there is, but sometimes, now don't get me wrong, but sometimes I make it a point of me being able to make them cry. Sometimes when you feel that there is so much emotion, but they are not, they are
Mhm.
clinging to something, and no, I may not cry. I try to say a few harsher words in order to make them cry. Harsh in the sense that we must be allowed to say it's a bad moment. You
Yeah.
know, we
Yeah.
must be able to say, "Hey, we are here and we feel bad.
Yes.
We feel
Yes.
bad here." And once you admit that you feel bad, then you can also find a way to explain. But there's also things that we are
Yeah.
thankful for, happy about, etc. But first, you have to admit that you are allowed to feel bad. And we live in a society today which always thinks everything has to be good and nice and lovely, and
Yeah.
you should not admit that you feel bad at some point. And
Yeah.
I don't agree in general, and especially not in those moments.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I very much agree with that. I can't say that I've necessarily, thought about how to um, make people cry or prompt the crying, but I certainly always
Yeah.
think about holding that space open and making clear that the space is very open. And I usually say something in my welcome about all faiths being well, but also all of the emotions. And especially if young children are present, I will say we all want each other to be okay, but part of being okay at a time like this is, of course, to feel sad and to cry.
Yeah. Well, Deborah says she says the grief needs to be promoted. Yes, and I agree. You say it in a nicer way than I just said it. Of course, I'm not saying, "Oh, hello, now I'm going to be bad with you and you cry."
Yeah,
I don't mean that, but let's say I use certain techniques knowing that they might cause that, right? So
yeah,
let's
yeah,
put it that way. Yeah.
yeah. Bring back wailing. I
Yeah.
don't know if I've mentioned this before in this podcast, but or this broadcast, my husband is Batak from North Sumatra,
Mm-hmm.
and there, of course, traditions are very, very different, and that is
Sure.
very much a culture which still grieves loudly and proudly, if you like.
Of
And
course.
I remember turning up to my father-in-law's funeral, and he was there laid out in his living room, and I came in and um, I was quite moved to see him lying there dead, and was kind of had a few tears. And my mother-in-law said to me, "No, you can wail like this," showing me
Yeah,
how to
yeah, yeah,
cry,
yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
I just didn't really know how to do it, as a British
No,
person.
right.
But it was amazing to be in that. Yeah,
Well, of course, that's also an interesting detail. Of course, it happens that we have funerals to conduct with people from different cultures, different
mm,
countries,
mm,
and you see, even within European countries, how different reactions to that. Well, I remember very well having a funeral with somebody from the Netherlands, and the whole family, basically, almost everyone there present was from the Netherlands, and it was a completely different way. In that case, it was much more cheery, much more uh, uh, um, upbeat than you would normally expect at a funeral.
mhm.
But as you just mentioned, Asian cultures often go very much into this wailing, and but then also when it's over, it's over. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
It's very different way of approaching those questions.
Well, what it seemed to me is that because the wailing was really allowed and enabled and encouraged, that there were also moments when there was a moment. It's a 3-day funeral, and there was a
Mhm.
moment on the night before the burial where all the kind of youth of the village come round and they were making music, and suddenly I kind of realised, hang on a minute, we're all dancing and singing around this dead body, and
Yeah,
smiling and laughing, and
yeah,
this
yeah,
is okay too. And it's almost like that could only happen because
yeah,
people that there's that sort of freedom of expression that allows the same space that's open for the expression of the pain and the loss is also
absolutely,
then open for life to go on and to
definitely.
yeah
Yeah,
yeah
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Well, that seems like a good place to bring our conversation towards an end, unless anybody
Yes.
joining us has any last questions for Rudolf. Great that you could join us, Debs, even though you were late. Debs is joining us from Australia, I have to say, so it's
Ah,
always a
okay.
slightly
Hello
unearthly
there.
hour. um, yeah, I
I think
thought
Australia invented the term funeral celebrant. I believe they were the first to use that terminology. Yeah,
definitely
yeah,
Australia is a very important place in terms of the
yeah,
birth of celebrancy as a sort of
absolutely.
recognised role and profession. Yeah,
Yes,
the first
yes. Mm.
place to make it a legal role with weddings as well.
Ah, right.
So I usually we end this broadcast with a moment to sort of hold us all together, and I was just thinking about what to bring this evening, and I thought I would share the Druid committal blessing because I recently did a funeral together with Philip Cargon. We worked together on a funeral for a friend of ours, and it was just lovely to hear those words again. And I thought some people joining us may, even though you may have been OBOD members for many years and have been coming to all kinds of OBOD ceremonies for the passing of the seasons and so on, you may not have been to a OBOD funeral. So I thought I would share the Druid's committal blessing, and perhaps let's make this a moment to send our love and blessings to those that we may hold in our hearts, our beloved departed, perhaps our family members or people that we may have lost in recent times. And let's just take a few breaths together. Let's take a breath with the earth beneath our feet. And let's take a breath with the sky above us. And let's take a breath with the oceans of the world surrounding the lands where each of us are, connecting us with all times, all places. And we hold our loved ones in our hearts, and perhaps we may mentally name them now. And may your journeys to the isles of the blessed, to the fields of bliss, to the land of freedom and splendour be swift and sure. May the light be your guide on the journey. May the blessings of the spirits of the tribe and of the ancestors, of time and of place and of the journey be with you. And may the blessings of the spirits of north and south, east and west be with you. And may the blessing of the Lord and Lady of the animals and the woods, the mountains and the streams be with you. And may the blessing of the uncreated one, whose child is the created word, and of the spirit that is the inspirer, be always with you. By the beauty of the fields, the woods and the sea, by the splendour that is set upon all that is, we send you our love and blessings, our dear ones. And I'd just like to complete with the words that I often use in my funerals, the words of the Celtic blessing, which some of you will be very familiar with. Blessings of deep peace. Deep peace of the running wave to you. Deep peace of the flowing air to you. Deep peace of the quiet earth to you. Deep peace of the shining stars to you. And we wish peace to the dead and to the living this time. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and those of you who are with us this evening, also those of you joining us later. Thank you so much, Rudolf, for sharing
Thank you for having me.
with us. And yeah, hope to meet you again sometime.
Absolutely.
Yeah, blessings to everyone who's joined us for this conversation. I'm going to end the broadcast now.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye, everyone.